Hey guys, Sonic Smashbro here, and now that we've had a little bit under a week with the new ban list, trying to figure it out, what it meant for Synchron going forward, and how hard it got hit, I think it's time I get my more in-depth thoughts on things, shall we? Which, spoiler alert, I'm still not a fan of these changes, at all. Well, that's kind of a lie. 2 of them I'm okay with, 2 of them I actually welcome even. So for those who didn't see the last video, Ravenous, Crocoddragon, Arcephus, and Tatsunoko both got Limit 1. This means we can no longer play Monster Reborn or any other Limit 1 staple like Rhoda, for example. And again, this had to happen. This combo was just too consistent regardless, and it had to get shot. And even then, like, how do I put this? It's just fine in general. The problem, as I mentioned before multiple times, is Jet Synchron and Tuning both getting Limit 3'd. I still believe this is not justified whatsoever, but in the case of Tuning, I think the only reason they did it was to try to force us to play Synchro Overtake and to market Synchro Overtake. Which again, I'm still not a fan of personally, but what can you do? Anyhow, so I did eventually make King of Games with this list card for card a little under a week ago. I just didn't have time to record this until now, nor the profile for that matter. Pain. So, after getting that far, what's my 2 cents with pure builds for Synchron? Pure builds are definitely still dead, but the Arcephus builds that are still running around, the Quasar Gandrax builds, Trishula Zero builds, those are still pretty much running rampant. So, honestly, this just proves a point. The problem was not the cards, the problem was the skill. For instance, nobody's really playing Junk Synchron anymore. They're now playing Road Synchron with Road Warrior as an overtake target and their main Synchro summon for Trishula Zero. Or they're doing like Coral Dragon formula and a random token for Quasar Gandrax on opponent's turn. Things like that, basically. Effectively, they are encouraging the skill playing the game for you. And you know this is the case if you look at the second effect in particular. So, either way, I do need to discuss 2 major problems the skill has that make it way too broken. The first of which being its second effect. Send all monsters you control to your graveyard. If the total of the original attack of the monsters sent to the graveyard is a combined 2,500 or more, set 2 random Signer Dragons with different names out of the 4 from outside of your deck. The reason why this is a problem is, with the wording being what it is, you can effectively play Mind Control or Crackdown, steal an opponent's boss monster like a Firewall or something like that, or a Scarlight, Red Nova, etc. Well, for the few Jack builds that do play Red Nova anymore. Or a Dark Magicians, stuff like that. Even a Neos if you wanted to. And essentially what this would do is this would mean the opponent just did the work for you and gave you 2 Signer Dragons for free, allowing you to essentially stall the game state out and disrupt the game state for an OTK for no effort whatsoever, or a free Quasar. And of course, the lack of deck restrictions is the major problem here, because again, people are still running all the other variants, like the Trishula build, Quasar Gandrax builds, Arcephus builds are still a thing. And it still actively encourages playing the skill not as intended, because none of those builds run full lineups of cards related to Yusei. In particular, the only ones I ever see are pretty much the obvious. Quasar, occasionally Stardust Warrior, Stardust Dragon's another one, Formula in there depending on the build, and Scarred Warrior. but like mainly just all of those minus Stardust Warrior, so that's 4 cards. And the others are completely different things altogether. Technically Tatsunoko because Synchro Tuners are kind of Yusei's thing, although they are also partially Antinome's thing, but nonetheless. With that said, looking at the skill now, there are 2 things I would change. And I think these changes need to happen. Send all monsters you control to the graveyard. If the total of the original attack of the monsters sent to your graveyard is a combined 2,500 or more, set 2 random Signer Dragons. So essentially what this would do is this would mean you can no longer take your opponent's monsters and have them count toward the Signer Dragon requirement, meaning you are discouraged from using Mind Control and Crackdown and whatnot to take their monsters and have the skill do the work for you. You now have to get to the Signer Dragons with your own cards, with your own deck, and with your own abilities. You need to work for it yourself. Yes, you can still send your opponent's monsters to grave, likely to out the Ibly, which I don't know if Ibly will see play anymore going forward, which if it doesn't, thank God, but it should have been banned anyway. And the second thing I would change is the lack of deck restrictions. There need to be some, big time. This skill can only be used if you begin a duel with an extra deck that contains Shooting Quasar Dragon, Shooting Star Dragon, Stardust Dragon, and no other monsters other than Warrior, Synchron, Stardust, or Tuner Synchro monsters. And the main deck must contain at least 12 or more cards that mention Synchro or Synchron in their text, so Synchro material qualifies here. At least 7 level 2 or lower Warrior type or Machine type monsters, and no monsters other than Synchron, Junk, or Warrior monsters, as in Warrior in name. Anyway, with that in mind, the skill would be forced to be used as intended, which would mean you can't play Mech Knight package in here anymore. You are discouraged from playing Mind Control or Crackdown in the first place. The extra deck doesn't have all this banish disruption to just say, no, your opponent cannot play the game, and just stalling you and disrupting the game state for the free Signer Dragon OTK or the Quasar. This means you now have to get this all done with your own power, rather than your opponent being told, no, you need to make the most of everything. You need to make the most of what you've got, what you know your opponent is using, and how to answer it with what you've got available. And at that point, Jet Synchron definitely could come off the list at that point. I don't know if it will. They might limit to it at that point, so that the limit 3 slot is open. Which at that point, I'd still be okay with that. But as for tuning, I don't know. I don't think it'll come off the list anytime soon if that happened. But again, I would love for it to. Mainly so that if you don't have the room for an overtake target or something like that, you at least have the option. Now, I know some people will tell me, oh, that would suck because we don't have things like Satellite Warrior or Excel Synchron as just, in general, interaction cards. We already have good interactions in the game with pure Synchron builds. In particular, Formula Synchron and Stardust Warrior. Because then that would proc Synchro Chase and get you back your Stardust Dragon, so you have another interaction on board for free. And if you do run into an Ibly, for example, with that line, you still have Scarred Warrior on board, or just Junk Warrior, or something. Usually Scarred Warrior, though. which would mean you can clog up all of your main monster zones, and they can't make use of Iblis. They just can't. It's not happening. Either way, I don't know, man. Like, to me, at that point, Synchron would be in a good spot if at least Jet would either come off the list or go to Limit 2, if you want to make sure it's still not quite as consistent as it used to be. And Tuning, again, I think should come off the list if the skill gets restricted, but I don't know if it will anytime soon, because again, they're trying to market Synchro Overtake, which I know what you're thinking. I know what a lot of people have told me. Just do this. And there we go. I don't agree with this personally for a couple of reasons. The first one being, as I mentioned before, I would think if they're gonna restrict the deck restrictions on the skill, you would think that to make full use of the value of Quasar, Konami would force you to play Shooting Star Dragon. But they don't right now for some reason. The other thing is, every card in this extra deck has a purpose. If Jet Warrior's only purpose is an overtake target and the rare float from Stardust Warrior, what point is there in having him around? One thing I believe in with Synchron in general, one thing I believe has always been part of the appeal, is every card having their own purpose, and in the case of the extra deck, everything having multiple purposes. That's one of the biggest reasons why I still prefer having Shooting Star over Jet Warrior, but even then, I do think Konami would restrict the skill, if they do restrict the skill, to force you to play the full anime Stardust line. So Stardust Dragon, Shooting Star Dragon, Shooting Quasar Dragon. Because here's the thing with Shooting Star. I know people will tell you it can miss timing. I have not once had that issue. Not once. The only time I ever did was when dealing with Psyframe Lord Zeta, but even then, that's not a big deal, because in that situation, you're either swinging for game anyway, or you're getting your Quasar back regardless. It's not a big deal. But on that note, what does this mean for Synchron going forward? Because there is no skill rebalance, meaning Phantom Knights are going to be tier 1 again, by the way. Yay. And by yay, I mean why? Anyway, pure Synchron builds definitely are still dead because they do not have the consistency anymore that they used to. They don't have the overall reliability in their boards, both offensive and defensive, that they used to. And the other builds, like the Arcephus build, or the Trishula Zero build, or the Quarion Androx build, will still be relevant, but that effectively means they are encouraging using the skill not as intended. So people are still going to be disrupting the game state, installing the game state for the Sign of Dragon OTK or the Quasar for free, and I just think that in general goes against the design of what this skill is meant to be. So, even then, I do still stand by this. The problem was not the cards, it was the skill. In multiple ways, in fact. I will say one thing before I do get around to profiling this in a couple of minutes. The only thing I would rather not be playing in here is the Dark Hole. I'd rather be playing Forbidden Chalice, but I don't have that, so these kind of have to do for now. But, on that note, that's all I really have to say. So, until the profile in a couple of minutes, later guys, and fingers crossed we do eventually get all of our stuff off the ban list soon. Here's hoping.